Hey everyone, today's video is a bit of an introduction to digital stamps and digital colouring books, and in particular I'm looking at the papers that you can use to print on. So what sort of papers are best, how you can print, and just really looking at the different options there are available. So a frequently asked question that I get on my channel is, what paper should I use to print on? What paper should I use with markers? How can I get my pages and stamps printed? And this entirely depends on what printer you have, whether you have access to a copy shop, and what supplies you want to use. So if you were to go into a shop and buy an adult colouring book, then you are limited to the paper. You have to match your supplies to the paper. So the paper may not be able to take watercolours, it may only work with pencils, it may be thin, the ink may bleed, it may not. You really have to match your supplies to the capabilities of the paper when you buy an adult colouring book. However, when you buy a digital adult colouring book, it's really, the field is wide open. You can do anything you want because you can print on whatever paper you want. And you may think you might be limited to what your printer can do. That can be true, but at the same time you can take your digital colouring book, the files, down to a copy shop, and you can print there on whatever paper you want. So really the versatility of digital colouring books is really great, and the options are endless for what you can do. You can print on watercolor paper, coloured paper, cardstock, any type of paper you want that you have that you like, you can print onto it. However, at the same time, the versatility is great. The endless choices can be a little overwhelming, particularly if you're just getting started and you just want to print out your pages to colour. So hopefully in this video I'm going to go through some of the different papers for the different mediums, some tips and tricks that I do, and just generally have a paper discussion so that hopefully it will give you some ideas and help you to feel a little less overwhelmed if you're feeling that, and hopefully be of some help to you all. So with digital colouring books, the first thing you do is you download your files. Now the file type really doesn't matter when it comes to printing. It can be PDFs, it can be JPEGs, whatever it is, it really doesn't make much difference. So you can get your pages printed at home on your home printer. Now I'm going to assume that most of you have a reasonably inexpensive printer. I have an HP inkjet home printer, and it's literally the cheapest one that HP has. So I am very used to making the most of a very cheap printer, and for most of my printing I do go down to the copy shop, because at a copy shop they can often print with waterproof ink, Copic proof ink, and they will print on whatever paper you want. You can take along your own paper, and you can print on really thick cardstock. So a copy shop is a good option if one's available to you, and the other thing they can do at a copy shop is bind up your pages. So here I've got the Breeze colouring book. It's all printed onto 300-gram cardstock. It's perfect for markers. It's very smooth cardstock. It's the one they actually have in the print shop. I didn't have to take this paper down to them at all. And the ink is waterproof, Copic proof, and she's the lady down there bound it up with a nice back cover and a spiral binding so I can have a proper book. But that's just one thing you can have done at a copy shop. So when it comes to different types of papers, the first thing to consider is what medium you're planning to use. So if you're going to use alcohol-based markers, whether they're Copics or Pro markers, Spectrum Noir, Prismacolor markers, whatever type of alcohol-based marker you're using, you'll want to use a paper that's suited to it. So here are a few examples of some paper that I use for alcohol-based markers. So my favourite paper is this paper here. It's Perfect colouring paper. It's by Holt's Office Support, and I have a feeling that it may be German. I might be wrong there, but that's what I think at any point. So I don't know whether it's very easy to get in the States, but it's pretty easy to get here in Europe. And this is my favourite paper for Copic colouring because it's ultra smooth. Ultra smooth, it blends beautifully, and it doesn't absorb masses of your ink. One of the things that I would say, you can use pretty much any paper you want, but if you're using markers, then I would avoid mixed media papers. So if you have a paper that's labelled mixed media, like this Canson paper, it feels very smooth, and you can put markers on it, but it sucks the ink up. So you'll run through your markers much quicker if you use a mixed media paper as opposed to a paper that's designed for markers. So as I said, this paper's good. The only downside to this paper is that I can get this paper through my printer at home. And I'll just quickly explain how I get thick cardstock through the printer. So this is 250-gram paper, but I can get 300-gram paper, thick cardstock like this pastel paper here, through the home printer. Now what you do is you take all the sheets of paper out of your paper tray and you press print on the computer, and then you go and stand by the printer and you hold the paper up like this, just above the little feeding rings. And when the printer starts to print, you'll hear the rings begin to turn because they want to feed the paper through. So what you have to do is you have to manually push the paper. When you hear the rings turning, push the paper down into the paper tray and in, so that the rings pick it up. Because the rings, I don't know the technical term for it, but usually with a printer you can hear when it starts to go, and with the HP inkjet printers it's quite noisy, so you do hear them. But you just feed it through, and often if it's a very thick piece of paper, I just kind of like put my hand at the top here as it's printing, just to apply a little bit of pressure until it gets about halfway, and that way it should print all the way through. The printer will not pick up this thick cardstock on its own. But if you stand there and manually feed each sheet through, then it will. But as I said, the problem with this particular paper is that it's so smooth and shiny that the ink doesn't dry properly. I think it must stay on top of the paper, and so it does smear. So when I want to print out colouring pages on this paper, I had to take it down to the copy shop. But do test on your own printer and see, because the inks are different, and the papers all react differently. So some papers may not smear, some will. You just have to test and see. But that one does, in my experience. But it is a lovely paper for Copics. Another good option for Copics is a Bristol board. Now this is the remnants of my Strathmore Bristol board. I don't have the cover anymore, but you can see it was the yellow type. And then I have some Winsor & Newton Bristol board. I also have some Sakura Bristol board, but it's an enormous pad and I can't fit it on camera. The Bristol board for markers is very good, and I found on this paper it doesn't. I can get this through my home printer and it doesn't bleed. So I think it's because the paper is a little tiny bit more absorbent than the Copic colouring paper is, and so the ink can dry properly or seep in more. I'm not quite sure, but I do find that this paper doesn't bleed. You do have to leave it to dry for an hour or so to make sure that the inks are properly dry. But yes, if you're using markers, Bristol board is a really good option. And I think no matter what you're doing, if you just want one quick option, then nice thick Bristol board like cardstock is always good, because you can do all sorts of things on Bristol board. You can do markers, pencils. It's a really good versatile paper. So let's move on to pencils. Now pencils really are the easiest medium. So if you're not sure where to start with digital colouring pages and you're worried about ink bleeding, using pencils is the easiest way to go, because you don't have to worry about the inks. The inks can be non-waterproof, non-Copic proof, it doesn't matter with pencils. Or pastels for that matter, any sort of dry medium, but pencils in particular. So for pencils, a Bristol board works well, depending on what brand of pencil, but for like Prismacolors and things, Bristol board works well. Bristol vellum works well. You can use a nice mixed media paper for pencils. This one's nice. I like this one as well. As I said, not good for markers, but good for pencils. Another paper that I like to use are coloured papers, and this is the Derwent pastel paper. It's very smooth, so it's good for pastels, but it's also good for pencils. And when you colour on a coloured paper, the pencil it gives a really different look to the work, and it's really nice. Another paper that's also quite good to use is the Strathmore Tone Tan, and you can just rip pages out of your sketchbook, trim them to fit your printer. And this is also very nice, and this can work with markers as well as pencils, but it's particularly nice with pencils, as you can get really nice effects with the whites, and the white in particular stands up more on Tone Tan paper. Anyway, so there's some nice options for pencils. And then we come to watercolour paper. Now watercolour paper is the trickiest watercolour is the trickiest medium to work around when it comes to colouring pages, because of the ink. Now you can do some really cool effects with if you have bleeding ink, you could incorporate it into the colouring, but on the whole I'm going to guess that most of you, if you're going to watercolour a colouring page, you don't want the lines to move. Now with normal home cheap inkjet printers, the ink is not waterproof. And and that's what it is with mine. So I take sheets of watercolor paper down to the copy shop, and I just have the lady down there print out my pages for me. And if you look closely, this is a really lovely cotton rag, really textured watercolor paper, and the print has come out gorgeous on it. So take paper down to your copy shop and see what they can do. Normally they're very happy to do whatever you want and to work with you. Don't be afraid to ask. Now, if you don't have a copy shop, or you can't get to one, or you want to get started right now and you want to use watercolor paper, there is a way you can do this at home. So if I just get a sheet here, so what you can do is you can print out your page on computer paper. So very thin 70-gram computer paper. Now it's I wouldn't colour on this because it's just far too thin for any media, but it is good for tracing. So you can take a thick piece of watercolour paper, a thin piece of copy paper, place it over the top and go and trace it. Now you can use a light box, but I do find that this works well with just a window. Choose a window in your house where it's got direct sunlight on it, tape this up, tape this over it, and you can see through really easily. You can see the black lines perfectly well. You can trace them with a multi-liner, so you can use a Copic multi-liner, they're waterproof, or a Pentel pocket brush pen, that's waterproof, or you can just use a pencil if you want to get a really soft effect and you don't like the black lines. And this works not just on watercolor paper but the Bristol board as well. If you are getting digital stamps or colouring pages and you don't like the black lines, then you can just trace, up to a window, take one piece of copy paper, a piece of your thick nice art paper, and trace your design on using a pencil or whatever you want. And that's a really nice way, and that's how you can get your image onto watercolor paper. It does take a bit more extra time, but that is a way that you can do it. So for watercolor paper, the one that I've been using here and showing you is this one by Canson. And it's 240 grams, very textured, really nice paper. Another pad that's a good one is a mixed media pad. This one from, what is this one? Another Canson one. It has a smooth side and a textured side, so you can really choose what you want and print whatever you want. You can really have lots of fun with this. So there are a selection of different papers. One other thing I'd like to mention here is if you want to mask out a drawing, so if you want to create a blended ink background, or you want to smear, or you want to do stamping with acrylic stamps, or you want to do something where you want to mask out this bit, but you don't want to put masking fluid or anything on the paper. Masking fluid doesn't work well on smooth cardstock anyway, but you're afraid that it might rip up the printed lines, then what you can do is you can print out your design onto, again, the cheap copy paper that you're bound to have in your home, 70-gram printer paper, and just cut your image out, cut all the way around it, and then you have your mask, and you can just place it on top of your image. So I think I have a copy of this one in the book. And this is just a really nice way, an easy, quick way of creating masks. So here it is on the nice paper, cut round it, place it over, and you can just sort of tack it down with a bit of tape or something, and then you can do your background, do your stamping, and then take the mask off, and you've got a clean piece. But you don't have to go around with your masking. It's much quicker doing a mask out of the cheap paper than it is to go around with masking fluid and try and fill up all the little places. You can do that, but I do like to use the paper masks for this because I can just print it out and it's really easy. So that is the different types of papers. As I said, so much versatility here. You can really have fun and experiment and just see what your printer can do. Just try feeding individual sheets through, and don't be afraid to go down to the copy shop and bring your own paper. Just ask, because most of them are really happy to help you, and and it's also not very expensive, because when you bring your own paper, you pay for your own paper, but they just charge you for the ink, and for black and white copies it's really inexpensive. It gets a little bit more pricey if you start binding things, but again, the binding, I think it cost me €2 or €3 to bind these pages up, so it's not a lot of money and it's a lot of fun. So hopefully, if you've been a little stumped by what papers to use when you're printing out, what papers will work. Hopefully this will answer some of your questions. And if you're just beginning and you're not really sure what supplies you're going to use, and all these different paper options are a bit confusing, then what I would suggest is to take the files down to a copy shop and ask them to print it onto 250 gram cardstock or 300 gram cardstock if they do it, and that should pretty much be good for whatever you want to use. And while you're at it, you can have them bind it, and then you have your own book. But I do think if you, for a general purpose, 250 to 300 gram cardstock will work really well for markers, for pencils, etc. So anyway, I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions, make sure you leave them down in the comments below. There's an Etsy link to the colouring book that I've been showing throughout this video. All these pages are from the Breeze colouring book, and there's an Etsy link to the book in the description box below if you want to get a copy for yourself to colour in. So anyway, have a creative week, everyone, and I will see you